I'm delighted to welcome Sanjay Reddy, who teaches economics at the New School for Social Research. He's made important contributions to the studies of inequality and poverty, and he's very intimately concerned with many of the things we are concerned with in rethinking development outside frames of orthodox economics. The title of his lecture is Global Development Goals, if at all, Why, When, and How. Sanjay.
Thank you. Thanks, Chandan. Good afternoon. Very glad to be here. Can you hear me? It's all right? Yeah. So maybe I need to speak more loudly. Can you hear me now? Yes? Okay. Chandan asked me to give this talk on the spur of the moment because I happen to be in the city, and I offered him a couple of options, and this is the one he selected. I'm very glad that he did so, because although I've written a paper on the topic fairly recently, this is the first time that I've spoken to a public audience after writing that paper, so it gives me a chance to try to make sense of my own arguments, to recall them. I am an economist by training, among other things, and I teach in an economics department, but I would say that this paper that I'm going to speak on today is really more in the tradition of, or I would like it to be seen as being more in the tradition of critical development studies. I personally am very much an opponent of disciplinary privilege, one might call it. The idea that a particular discipline has a special vantage point that gives it better purchase on a specific applied problem in the social world in particular, where I think that there's very often a need for deep integration between the insights of different disciplines in order to make sense of the world. And to me, development studies as a discourse, as a discipline, to the extent it exists as a discipline, like environmental studies or urban studies or public policy analyses, is one of the spaces in which that integration can take place, does to an extent take place, should take place. And I therefore would like to identify myself with it, even if development studies as a field is very much, or has been very much on the defensive for a number of years. So those development studies scholars who do explicitly identify themselves with the field are known to write articles on the question of why development studies. Stuart Corbridge, for instance, is someone who's done this, someone who comes to mind, one of my former collaborators on a project. But there are many others. So there is a sense, I think, in the field of development studies that its rationale is less clear today, in particular because the very question of what is a developing country and whether there is something that is particularly, a form of knowledge that's particularly appropriate to developing countries has been placed in question. And of course, the fast-growing emerging countries such as India, China, until recently Brazil, have been very much at the center of this call for rethinking. Now, my topic, as Chandan mentioned, more specifically concerns global development goals. Now, some of you may recall that there were things called Millennium Development Goals. I assume you've all heard of the Millennium Development Goals. And how many of you have heard of the Sustainable Development Goals? Would you raise your hand? All of you, or not almost all of you? Some of you? Half? 60%? All right. When I'm not here, I live in New York. And New York is where the United Nations is situated. And not far from New York is Washington, D.C. And so what passes for development studies, or development discourse, or development debate in these places is very often conducted at a rather high level of abstraction. My family actually comes from, on both sides, from villages not far from here, so I'm very also aware that there is another reality. If one is going to talk about development studies, one cannot stay at the abstract high level of debates on global goals. One has to also, and I would say even more so, concern oneself with, in some sense, ground reality. So I take as my charge to try to connect these in some fashion and to ask the question of whether the high-level discourse on development really contributes much to our understanding of development or of how development should be gone about, or more generally, if you don't want to use the word development, how we should go about economic and social change, policy making, and public prioritization. There is an important book on the history of development by a scholar named Gilbert Rist, a Swiss scholar. And in the second edition of his book, which was written after the Millennium Development Goals were first adopted by the United Nations in 2000, he added a chapter to his book in which he used the phrase development in shreds to refer to the era of the Millennium Development Goals. Now, why did he do that, and what did that mean? In some sense, what Rist was trying to do was to, by using this phrase, was to capture the idea that if development meant anything at one point in time, it meant something holistic. It required or demanded an integrated conception of economic or social reality. It was very much, of course, for that reason, associated with the idea, certainly in the mid-20th century and for a considerable period thereafter, of national plans. The Planning Commission in India was one of many such entities around the world, not only in developing countries, but also in developed countries such as France or the Netherlands, which aimed to bring about such integration, right? With the idea that, in some sense, the coherence of the actions undertaken by the state or the society required forward thinking about what interrelations there were, what complementarities there were, both across different sectors and over different periods of time. And that without doing that, one would end up with a set of actions which were less effective than they could be, if not altogether ineffectual. Now, planning, certainly understood as an idea of comprehensive guidance for the actions of the state or the society, has come into considerable disrepute, in part for good reasons, but in part for not so good reasons. And in another recent piece that I wrote on the abolition of India's Planning Commission, I discussed some of these, some of the arguments that one could give on either side. But the idea of development being in shreds that Gilbert Rist put forward, I think very much has to do with the thought that the MDG era is one of, in some sense, balkanization. That even if development is used as a word, it has been reduced to a set of, it had been reduced or come to be reduced to a set of, in some sense, sectoral conceptions, right? The word sector is one of those, or sectoral is one of those bureaucratic words which is used by development practitioners and professionals in places like the World Bank. So you have a set of sectoral conceptions having to do with education, for example, or with health, or with water and sanitation, all of which are, of course, very important and desirable things. But the idea that one can articulate what it is that's desired in terms of those individual things taken one by one, without putting them in the context of some idea of a comprehensive strategy of economic and social change, which is to be desired in any given country's case, or indeed in the case of the world as a whole. I'd like to contrast this just by way of bringing out what's at stake with the discussion in the 1960s and 70s on development. The United Nations adopted the first decade of development, I think, in the 1960s. And then after that, in the 1970s, when many of the developing countries were riding high with high commodities prices and so on, there was a discussion about a so-called new international economic order, the question of how the economic structures in the world could be or should be reformed so as to be more accommodating of development. And that was the period when the target of aid, what has come to be called aid, though not all of us think that the word aid should be used in every such instance, since in some cases one could argue that there are other reasons other than benevolence that aid is given or should be given. But the target that aid should reach a level of 0.7% of GDP was first expressed in that period of the 1970s as part of the demand for a new international economic order. But the argument that was made by the developing countries, in the United Nations in particular, didn't just have to do with resource transfers, it had to do with, in some sense, structures and their reform. So for instance, the commodity-producing countries that I already mentioned were very interested at that time in the question of commodity price stabilization, and some initiatives were put forward in that regard in order to achieve greater such stabilization, and so on and so forth. That was a period when there was a broader discussion about economic and social structures in the international system. And of course, that discussion more or less went away, and I think an important reason for that was that in some sense in the 1980s, the same developing countries that were the linchpins or the most important agents of the 1970s discussion ended up being on the defensive because of the debt crisis and many other reasons. So instead one had a wave of structural adjustment policies which brought about really fundamental reorientations of the countries involved and their adoption of and embrace of a different kind of economic order, which was much more centered on what one might call riding the tiger of private property-centered, market-oriented globalization. I like the metaphor of riding the tiger because I think that, unlike some of my colleagues who think that neoliberal globalization always leads to doom, I actually think that the more accurate way to think about it is that it's a high-risk strategy, and that there are some societies which have made very selective use of the opportunities provided by neoliberal globalization to good effect. And one can think here about Singapore, for example, admittedly a very small city-state, or even South Korea, which in a phased way and a very selective and elective way made use of some of those opportunities and only undertook a more comprehensive liberalization later on. But at any rate, in the 1980s, we have a wholesale embrace by a wide range of countries of these policies, 80s and 90s, right? In India, of course, many people would point to 1991 as the crucial year, but there's a debate about that, about how the chronology should be defined and whether, in fact, the reasons for India's adoption of market liberalization and even the beginning of its adoption are actually much more linked to choices made in the 1980s. As some people have argued, I think Arvind Subramanian and Danny Roderick, for example, have argued this, among others. So, so this is in some sense the historical background, right, in terms of the global discourse that structural reform and structural demands play a more important role in the earlier phase. Now, in the 1990s, what happens is that, it seems to me, is that one has a different sort of an accommodation that takes place. Human rights discourse, interestingly, after a very long lag of about 40 years, comes much more to the center of the global development discussion. And there are also a series of meetings, international meetings or global meetings, which are shepherded by the United Nations or orchestrated by the United Nations, that involve a rabble of civil society organizations taking part, that articulate their demands very much in terms of human rights. Though, of course, there are also the sectoral managerial professionals of the development enterprise that are involved too. And here I'm thinking about the world conferences that took place on subjects such as health, education, and, well, not health actually, social development, education, the rights of children, and so forth. So there were a number of different global conferences that took place. And in each of these, women, Beijing conference, you had a international organization dimension, but you also had what I just called this rabble of civil society organizations and activists, right? And some of those are rather well-funded and well-connected, and some of them aren't. But it looks much more like a disorganized set of gatherings in which there are diverse voices that are at play. And of course, those voices are corralled by the dominant actors, whether in the international organizations or the more influential civil society organizations in certain ways. But nevertheless, I would say there's an aspect of that kind. Foucault has a concept which is called the heterotope. And it's a place, the heterotope is a place where there are all sorts of entities that are present there which are incommensurable one to the other. So you cannot even think about them. You can't even hold them in your mind easily all at once. Okay? So the famous Encyclopedia of Borges is an example of that, if any of you are familiar with the writings of the Argentine writer. But I think this is an interesting thought in regard to many different contexts, that that when you have a truly democratic discussion, in some sense, which brings together a very wide range of participants, they will not all speak in voices that are mutually intelligible, and they may not even be talking about the same thing, and that's why conversation is difficult. Now, of course, I am still talking about United Nations conferences, so there is a limit to which they could, in fact, be heterotopes. But I think there's a flavor of that in these 1990s conferences. I think of them as democratic moments to a degree for that reason. Now, what happens in 2000 is that the United Nations shifts to a completely different modality. There are no more international conferences involving the rabble. What does one have instead? One has global goals. And the global goals describe, or aim to describe rather comprehensively, what it is that is desired by who? By us, ostensibly, the world community. But was the world community consulted? This is a very interesting and important question which we'll have to investigate as part of our potted history of these events. The summit on social development, which took place in Copenhagen, I think in 1995, was one of the conferences that I mentioned in which the rabble was present, at least to an extent. But it did also lead to a final document in which there was a listing of various sorts of social development, in effect, targets, many of which had a quantitative dimension to them in terms of extension of or improvement of education, access to education, health, water and sanitation, and so on. That was, in some sense, as I argued, a gathering in which there were diverse voices. But those particular targets were then taken up, along with targets that derived from other such conferences, and became part of an endeavor of the advanced countries, influential in development, the donor countries, so-called donor countries, and I believe the United Kingdom was especially important in this effort, to define what they called International Development Targets, or IDTs. Now, the IDTs, unlike these targets which derived from the large-scale conferences, were in effect brought together, collated from these prior declarations, manifestos, agendas, and so on, by the donors in their back rooms, as it were. And their motivation for putting these quantitative targets together was, I would say, rather different. It was not only to ensure that the world as a whole focused on a particular goal, but also very much, I think, in the donor discourse of that time, about bringing about what they called accountability. Okay. Now, what does this word accountability mean in the development context? Well, I think that, crucially, the idea of accountability here, certainly as propounded by the donors, the donor countries and their development agencies, involved the premise that, in some sense, many developing countries were insufficiently committed to the project of development, and in particular, to bringing about development for the poorest, or bringing about extension of services, basic services where that had been lacking. And so the notion came to be that the International Development Targets would provide a framework for demanding and for ensuring that the recipients of aid, and of course there are certain countries, especially smaller and poorer countries, for which aid is very important. That is not the case, obviously, for India and many other countries with considerable domestic resources, but there are many smaller and poorer countries for which it's very important. So the idea was that this framework would provide a reference point for a compact, in effect, a kind of a contract as to how aid would be employed. At that time, there were various other such parallel initiatives. I remember that that some of the UN agencies concerned with social development, for example, put forward something they called the 2020 initiative, which required that 20% of both governmental resources of aid recipients, but also 20% of the resources provided by aid donors would be devoted to so-called basic social services, the social services which go to the poorest and which have most direct relevance for elementary capabilities, we might say. And it turned out, based on the studies that were done at that time, that it wasn't just the developing countries which were not devoting a large share of their resources to these basic social services, but even the aid donors were devoting a very small part of their aid program to these basic social services, which was why even a modest target of 20% was actually a target that required to be explicitly specified and to be made into one. Okay. So the IDTs are formulated, and these become, in effect, the predecessors of the Millennium Development Goals, which come to be taken up by the United Nations through a process which I think even today is a little bit shrouded in mystery and a little bit controversial. Because the Millennium Declaration, in which the heads of state came together in the UN General Assembly, did not explicitly specify the detailed list of goals and targets which was subsequently adopted. But that rather came about through a bureaucratic process ex post, which was then sanctified subsequently by various United Nations processes. Now, the Millennium Development Goals very quickly became the governing discourse of development, right? And I think it's very important to understand what I've just mentioned regarding the particular provenance of the goals and their history in terms of the donors pressing for them in order to understand the function that they subsequently played. If you look at the Millennium Development Goals, as all of you will know, 7 of them, the first 7, have to do with, in effect, the responsibilities of developing countries, or they may be conceived of as joint responsibilities of developing and developed countries. And the eighth has to do with the responsibilities of the developed countries. And it includes such things as to raise official development assistance to 0.7% of GDP, the goal formulated in the 1970s. Now, Jeffrey Sachs, some of you may have heard of him. Has anyone heard of Jeffrey Sachs here? Some of you, okay. A well-known development economist, among others, devoted themselves to the question of how to achieve the development goals. Now, happily, in this era was also the rise of the randomized trial and other such technologies for trying to get at what works. I put that in quotation marks, what works, because that's their notion of how it is that one identifies what works and what doesn't work. In effect, it's a very microeconomic, technical, intervention-centered discourse. Finding out, for example, that using an insecticide-dipped mosquito net is very efficacious in reducing prevalence of malaria or other mosquito-borne diseases. So what is the policy conclusion? Distribute or perhaps subsidize bed nets. Which one of those? Will run another randomized trial and find out which of those is better, and so on and so forth. So Jeffrey Sachs and his group, which came to be closely associated with the United Nations in this effort, in effect draw on this highly specific intervention-centric point of view. Here again, I think we can see why development is in shreds from RIST's perspective, right? To constitute a plan, except that they realize that the word plan is not to be spoken these days, but in effect a plan for furthering the goals. And this consists in identifying those interventions which work and rolling them out. Financing that process with aid, where possible, in particular in the poorer countries such as in sub-Saharan Africa. And a debate then rages between Jeff Sachs on one side, Bill Easterly, Paul Collier, other economists on the other side, as to whether aid is really effectual or not. And later on, it develops into a debate much later as to whether randomized trials have efficacy or not in identifying what works. Right? But this is in some sense an internal debate among the those who already occupy a certain circle. David San, an economist who was critical of this approach at the time, referred to it as reminiscent of Gosplan, the Soviet planning agency. So although Jeffrey Sachs was very much a market-oriented economist, the prescription for developing countries was not only to identify what works, but to roll it out, scale it up, as they like to say. Now, as I pointed out in work with a collaborator, Antoine Uti, at the time, among the many problems with this approach was that it completely missed the significance of learning. That how one learns what works is by trying things out and comparing that across jurisdictions, right? So for example, I remember that many, many years ago, the very first study I ever did on development was about midday meals programs. And what I found was that at that time, the primary interest in midday meals programs was as a way to address undernourishment. And the critics of midday meals programs, and there were many, attacked them on the ground that they were not an effective, or at least cost-effective, way of reducing undernourishment. But very quickly the debate shifted. Why? Because it was discovered that the real impact of midday meals programs on a mass level, if adopted at the level of a state, for instance, as was done in Tamil Nadu, was to increase school enrollment. Now, it's not that people didn't imagine that school enrollment would be increased by midday meals programs, but they didn't imagine that that would be the primary objective of adopting such a policy. But once that was understood, then of course, the Supreme Court of India pushed for these policies, these programs to be adopted nationwide, and there was a more general recognition, that that was the real benefit and that that benefit was sufficient justification. Right? And that's not the only instance. There are many, many instances. I would say that development is replete with such instances. The notion that there's a best practice which can be identified and then rolled out, as opposed to it's being discovered through some process of learning and experimentation and mutual comparison across jurisdictions, is fundamentally flawed. But the notion of Sachs and collaborators was that they would identify the best practices and then call for them to be rolled out across the world. And in fact, Jeff Sachs also tried to demonstrate, to use his word, if I recall, the efficacy of these interventions in specific places, the so-called Millennium villages, which were specific sites in which he undertook handsomely funded initiatives of this sort. The development debate was very much centered then on these questions in the first decade, and in particular the first half of the period from 2000 to 2015. By 2011-12, one starts to hear murmurs in the global debate that the MDGs have been a grand success and they must be followed by a new set of development goals. Now, it's taken me a long time to get here, and this is my real subject. And now I have probably very little time to talk about it, but at any rate, let me try to do that. I have found this quite fascinating as an external observer. I'm not paid by the United Nations, unlike most of those people who write about these topics, many of them. So I do not feel a personal interest in boosting them. You might say I have a personal interest in attacking them, but I would claim not to have a personal interest in attacking them either. Were the MDGs a success? Well, it's a very, very interesting question. If one takes a detailed scorecard approach, that's again their word, to assessing whether the MDGs were a success, I think, and this is something we discuss in a paper, which I'm happy to have circulated by Chandan later, that at best the scorecard is mixed. And I think it's even plausible to argue that the MDGs were not a success. There's another word for not a success, but I don't have to use it. Let's take MDG 1. There's a very amusing article by my former collaborator, Thomas Poga, on the first Millennium Development Goal, which is on poverty reduction. And Thomas Poga points out in that article a number of things. First of all, the first Millennium Development Goal is defined as eradicating poverty. Has any of you looked up the word eradication in the dictionary recently? My recollection is that eradication has something to do with elimination, complete elimination, but the definition of eradication in the first MDG is to halve, to reduce by 50%, all right? So that's a very unique contribution to the English language of the MDG framework. Now, not only is elimination defined in that unique way, but in addition, as Thomas shows, there were a number of changes over time in how the goal was defined. So for instance, you would think that a goal adopted in the year 2000 and referring to a period from 2000 to 2015 would refer to changes or improvements, reductions in poverty in this case, between 2000 and 2015. But no, it backdates the initial year to 1990. Okay, why? No explanation given. But of course, the reason is that to the extent you backdate it, you can make it easier to achieve because of one country, China. And China's enormous contribution to reducing income poverty in the world, especially after 1990. So it becomes easier to achieve. Another example, which Thomas points out, there was a shift between various drafts, between defining the first goal in terms of the absolute number of poor to defining the first goal in terms of the proportion of poor, and then in turn, the proportion of the developing country population that's poor. And each of those shifts make it easier to achieve because the population in the world is growing. So it's easier to reduce the proportion than the absolute number. And still more so if you focus on the part of the population that's growing fastest, namely the developing country part. and so on and so forth. So these are bureaucratic maneuvers. But be that as it may, let's ask the question, focusing on that particular goal, was it achieved? Well, answer is not really, outside of China. Okay. So if it was achieved in the aggregate because of China. But it is not at all obvious that you could say that it was achieved globally if you think that it's being achieved in a broad-based way across regions and countries is very important. And very, very crucially, if you ask the question, why was it achieved, even in China, or wherever it was the case that poverty may have fallen, I think that it would be very, very difficult to argue that MDG-related efforts had anything to do with it, as opposed to economic growth, which took place in China for reasons that are various, but certainly China was engaged in a world historical transformation, right, well before the MDGs were adopted. And of course, it's not only China. Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, has had a moderately good record, better than expected, right, in this period. And that owes everything to the commodities boom in the world, which has now ended. But there was a considerable period where prices of basic commodities went very high. You know this in Karnataka. In Bellary, not far from here or elsewhere, there were legal and illegal mines exporting natural resources to China. Nobody thought of India as a country abundant in natural resources earlier, but this was underpinned by the commodities boom. Similarly, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, etc., whether it's wheat, whether it's iron ore, whether it's gold or oil. Nothing, or almost nothing, to do with the MDGs. And not surprisingly, there was a shift within the countries involved in terms of the importance that they attach to this discourse. And one can go on and on with respect to each of the targets. I don't have time to do that, but I'm happy to go into it in the discussion. Let me just mention one before I move on to the SDGs in the short time that remains, the successor goals. I've mentioned more than once the aid target, 0.7% of GDP, going back to the 1970s. Now, you would think that in the period of the Global Development Goals, trumpeted as a wonderful way to raise consciousness and draw attention to basic human priorities, that this target would have been achieved. Let us forget it's being achieved. You would think that the proportion of aid in GDP would have at least gone up a little bit. Has it? The answer is no. Okay, it's more or less remained constant or gone down slightly. And that's despite various redefinitions in the concept of aid, which the OECD Development Assistance Committee, which is the entity that adds up all the numbers, has done. Okay? So that target, which is part of Goal 8, has been robustly not achieved. Forget all the other aspects of Goal 8, which are not quantitative. Goal 8, it will not surprise you, is the goal with the fewest quantitative indicators. Because, of course, the developed countries were quite hesitant to be held to account within the Millennium Goal framework. Okay, let's move on to the Sustainable Development Goals. Chandan, do I have 5 minutes, 10 minutes? 10 minutes, wonderful. So as I mentioned, starting around 2011, one starts to hear a drumbeat, especially if one lives in New York. Happily, since you are here, probably you don't hear that drumbeat as much. India, as you know, never embraced the MDGs. It was one of the countries to more or less reject the MDGs. And it also rejected a lot of other things. For example, poverty reduction strategy papers, which were the official framework of the World Bank for providing bank loans to countries, and which also have played an important role since their creation in IMF lending protocol, have not been created, not been produced by India. And until the abolition of the Planning Commission, the argument that was given was that the plan, India's plan documents substituted for the poverty reduction strategy papers, and the Bank and Fund accepted that. Now that the commission has been, Planning Commission has been eliminated, by which I don't think they mean reduced by half, but actually completely eliminated. We'll have to see how that argument goes. So the drumbeat begins. Now, why? Given that we don't even know if they have been a success. In fact, the only evaluations that have been done of the MDGs that are in some sense objective do not come from within the United Nations system, or at any rate, were not published in official United Nations documents. There's one important paper, among others, by a UN statistician who was forced to publish this paper privately because the United Nations didn't want it officially circulated, which showed that if you ask the question of whether the trend of improvement in particular indicators increased at all as a result of the adoption of the MDGs, the answer is no for many of them, because there was already a trend of improvement. You can think of child health, for instance, where there have been secular improvements for quite some period of time. There are, of course, indicators such as maternal mortality, where there has been a considerable improvement, and I think many activists argue that the MDGs played a role there. I think that bureaucracy is very important here. Before I studied economics, I studied social anthropology, and I studied, before that I studied something else, but I studied with somebody who really was very interested in the question of bureaucracy. And he convinced me, and it's an insight that stays with me to this moment, that a lot of the processes that we ought to be interested in are really best understood as consequences of bureaucratic maneuvering of one kind or another, or bureaucratic inertia. And I think this is a case in point, that the global development bureaucracy in the United Nations, in the donor agencies, to a considerable extent in governments, especially in many of the countries which have less domestic or indigenous intellectual capacity and financial and political capacity, there was a considerable realignment around the MDG idea, or an adoption of the MDG idea. And it became hard to envision development in any other terms. It also became clear that this was a money spinner, at least to an extent. Okay? And to the degree that there had been, let us say, rather specific skills developed, if only in the circulation of certain kinds of slogans, that became, I think, something that enjoyed a lot of influence. Maybe I'm being a little too cynical here, but we can discuss that. At any rate, it was more or less taken for granted that it would happen, that there would be successor goals, and there were. Now, how did the successor goals come about? The United Nations created something called the Open Working Group, which was supposed to help define these goals. And there were various processes involved, resolutions and this and that. One's eyes glaze over, actually, when one tries to understand these things. But there was a multi-stage process that was involved, and the Open Working Group was asked to consult on what form the goals would take. Now, note that the Open Working Group undertook consultation in a rather, let us say, in a rather high-tech fashion, which involved asking for comments from around the world, online and so on. On the surface, it was extremely open, but I would say that it looks rather closed as compared to these 1990s conferences I mentioned, which are more democratic moments where you have the diversity of voices in one place at one time. Here it looks like a much more managed, orchestrated process. But what comes out of it is not altogether bad, arguably. The SDGs, not altogether. There are two aspects that have been pointed to which I think ought to be given some attention and credit. One of them is that the Sustainable Development Goals, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, are more explicitly about a range of considerations, not only to do with eliminating poverty and deprivation, but all the different aspects of having conditions for a good life on the planet. And so they encompass much more questions of ecological balance and sustainability, for instance. And in addition to this much broader diversity of concerns, concern with inequality, for instance, not mentioned in the MDGs, there's also a demand that all countries will be bound by these, not just the developing countries or the developed countries insofar as they are partners in development, aid donors or the like, but all countries have obligations in this regard. So on the surface, if one reads the SDG documents, there is in these dimensions, I think, something progressive about them, certainly as compared to the MDGs. Nevertheless, one sees again the balkanization of development into different sectoral aspects. And I think there are a number of difficulties which arise if one inspects them more closely. Is it a wish list, or is it a program of action? Now, with the SDGs as with the MDGs, there's, I would say, and I cannot develop this at length now, but let me just point to it, a fundamental confusion between means and ends, as well as between different sorts of ends. Now, my own point of view is that to formulate goals that are either too general but sectoral, or too specific and involving highly particular things that countries are asked to do or international organizations are asked to achieve, is in different ways to bind oneself. There's what one might call a problem or even a paradox of specification here. One can be too general or one can be too specific. The more general it is, the closer one gets to a normative ideal or a clarion call, which could be motivating, but the more useless from the point of view of providing any guidance for action. The more specific one becomes, the more one binds oneself to points of view as to how the general aim should be achieved, which might end up being far too specific and unhelpfully so. Right? Let me just give one example. There are many examples of this kind. The MDGs had this problem too, of course. They focused in relation to health on highly specific disease targets: malaria, tuberculosis, HIV/AIDS, and so on. They didn't pay any attention to the conditions of a viable public health infrastructure, what is called in the literature the strengthening of health systems. Now, around the world, as you know, that's a crucial concern. The rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria has everything to do with the non-existence or malfunctioning of health systems. India is one of the countries which is badly affected despite its other resources. The Ebola crisis in West Africa had everything to do with the non-existence of health systems. So to take a balkanized view in which one has a selective list of diseases, but that one tries to provide medicines for or to target in some way, but pays no attention to the systemic point of view, led to a crisis in this case. Ebola, a new disease, or not a new disease, but a disease which arose for the first time in certain countries and spread very rapidly due to the systematic neglect and malfunction, going back to the structural adjustment era, in fact, of the public health infrastructure. Now, to my mind, if one wishes to rescue the SDGs and to have them play some type of beneficial role in how we think about development, we ought to think about them in broadly the following way. That taken as a whole, taken as a set of goals, they provide a vision of what one might call in various terms a flourishing society, world society, or the conditions for flourishing lives for human beings, or something along those lines. A normative conception of what it is that should be achieved in world society as a whole that involves a very general notion of the good for the world population, but which leaves open the question of exactly how that good should be achieved. To the extent that the goals have, partly because of the legacy of the accountability discourse and the continued, instantiated in the MDGs and the continued reference to that idea, to the extent that they have involved a highly specific focus on targets and indicators, they have taken away from that and become rather much more part of a bureaucratic, managerial understanding of how development is to be achieved. There are reasons that individual countries may wish to prioritize one goal as opposed to another, or one target as opposed to another, if there are to be targets at all. And to provide considerable flexibility in the high-level conception of what it is that is to be attained, for that to be done, it seems to me is essential, not only from the standpoint of enabling these goals to be relevant to individual countries, but to ensure that they don't become a shackle to the degree that they actually do direct the flow of resources in a particular fashion. Now, in practice, it remains to be seen which direction the SDGs will be taken and how they will be interpreted. Some of you may be aware that there are already 69 targets which have been defined. 17 goals, 69 targets. And underneath the targets are going to be indicators, which are very detailed, often quantitative foci for action. And it is estimated, they've not been defined yet, or it is, I shouldn't say estimated, it is thought likely that they will be even larger in number. The numbers that I've heard quoted run anywhere from 100 to 300. Many people think that 100 is the smallest number of indicators that there could possibly be on this list once the organization is done with them. Now, if you ask the question of whether it's possible to keep 100 indicators in your own mind at one time, I think the answer will be plain that it's not. But of course, the purpose of these indicators is in part to provide guidance to sector-specific organizations, such as World Health Organization or United Nations Children's Fund or what have you, and individual ministries in countries that may choose to refer to these and to adopt them in some fashion. And from that point of view, perhaps the operative list out of that 69 or 100 or 300 69 targets or 100 or 300 indicators will be much smaller. Right? Nevertheless, there is a flavor of bureaucratic complexification here. And I think that that is not to the good. I've gone on for considerable length of time. Let me just again refer to the idea of development in shreds, mix my metaphors a bit and say that it's perhaps time instead for us to return to a much more holistic way of thinking about development. And I think a critical development studies point of view is very crucial in that. We ought to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Let me stop there and we can have a discussion, yeah?
Thanks, Sanjay, for the talk. So development is sectoral. Do you see development becoming interventional in the sense that as it fragments further, the question of development where there is no coherent sort of picture, and all we're now interested in is what works and what doesn't. Do you see the breakdown of these goals to more targets, more bureaucratic managerial approaches, coupled with this curiosity about which intervention works and why it doesn't, forcing development to even sectors to break down into basic, tools and techniques and things that have to be done?
A couple of questions at once.
Sure. Maybe if I could have a piece of paper, I don't want to grab this, but if I could have a piece of paper, I'll just note down whatever is said. Thank you. Thanks so much, yeah.
Do you want to ask again?
And I have another question. So the critique of these RCT comes also from people like Land Pritchett and Michael Woolcock and Matt Andrews about the focus in development. They've lost the idea of state capacity. State capacity as a thing to be understood and has been bypassed by both development discourse and development practitioners. I was wondering whether you had any thoughts on that approach.
Thanks, Sanjay, for the talk. I have two questions. One a short one and the other one slightly longer, I guess. The first one, the short one, I think perhaps is misaddressed, but let me just ask it nonetheless. You spoke of 1990s and the sort of reanimation of the human rights discourse. Could you speculate a bit more on that? As in, what's the relationship? I mean, was it symptomatic of the rise of the so-called neoliberal discourse? And if so, in what all ways? Or are these two very distinct heterogeneous trajectories, although not unrelated, right?
What was that?
Although not unrelated, right? The second question has to do with, in a sense, the heterotopia, the Foucauldian heterotopia that you invoked, but in some ways also speaks to what in continental thought, I mean, someone like Badiou would call it the time of atonality, right? Which is to say that one of extreme confusion, incertitude, and so forth, where it seems the liberal, the Marxist discourse seems to have actually collapsed, for a variety of historical set of reasons. In that context, then, the only thing that seems to have remained aside from the neoliberal market-oriented, processes, trajectories, philosophical thoughts, and so forth, seems to be pragmatism. Is that, do you see it in that fashion? I mean, I'm wondering as to where you're speaking from. We heard the critiques that you actually provided of, the financial institutions, the structural adjustments, et cetera, right? I'm just wondering, where do you stand as you're actually looking at the entire process, right? Partly because I'm referring to the incertitude in and through which the sort of, these processes are unraveling at this point, right? So, thanks.
One more question. Chiranjeev.
I have to disagree a little bit with the...
Yes, would you please introduce yourself?
I'm Chiranjeev Sen.
Yes, of course, Chiranjeev. Yes, of course. Sorry, I couldn't recognize you from here. Thank you.
Yeah.
Please, yeah.
See...
please, disagree away. Yes.
Yeah, a little bit, in the sense that while what you say is, I don't question that, but we have to put it in the context of what you think is going on. And essentially, I would argue that the battles over these Millennium targets and SDGs and so on and so forth is actually a way in which the so-called rabble is getting its foot in the door and being able to argue. Without such a kind of a platform, you won't have anybody else except the state versus the donor agencies. The second point is that if you look at it in the context, this whole MDG, SDG business is actually a fight, is a way of putting back on the agenda development from the time in which so much focus had gone into restructuring and which was absolutely hopeless. So the global level things had been taken over by economic growth and restructuring and so on and so forth. So this MDG, MDG certainly played a role in putting it back on track. So therefore, I would support that. The next thing is, what do you think these governments are up to? I mean, you want to strengthen state capacity and so forth, but actually, in the present situation after, say, 1990 or so, the character of many of these countries, partly because of the way in which the donor agencies have behaved, have actually started disengaging from development issues altogether. So you needed some method to make them accountable. So otherwise, there is no platform through which civil society or even the donor agencies can hold governments accountable. And I mean, you don't like the word, but actually, I don't see the world as one in which the same spirit that prevailed in the 1950s and 60s of developmental goals and so on and so forth, the national economic strategies, that has been eradicated. So if that's not there, then what seems to remain is more of growth and growth alone. And that's why I felt a little nervous as to know how to react to this China business, because the conclusion would be, let's go for growth. So in other words, I think that growth alone doesn't work. We may not be able to redo the China. And if there is going to be a global debate in which non-state actors have a voice, at the moment I don't see any other platform except this. Basically what I was.
Yeah, I think that you've raised a number of important issues. I mean, all of you, if I could take some of the points together, because I think Vishnu's and Chiranjeev's have some point of intersection, actually. Let me just note that India has embraced the SDGs, although it rejected the Mdgs, which is very interesting. In fact, the government of India organized a special session in New York to advertise that it had accepted the SDGs. In fact, it was enthusiastic about the SDGs after the abolition of the Planning Commission. And Arvind Panagaria spoke there at that session, and he said that while the government of India heartily endorsed the SDGs, it had only one major qualm, which was that there was not enough focus on growth. So that, I think, brought out the fault lines a little bit. That in some sense it was embracing something that was very difficult to reconcile with their philosophy. So I don't disagree with you that if this is the only game in town, then one ought to, in some sense, embrace it as a kind of counterpoint to growthism. Right? On the other hand, I don't think that that should require that we suspend judgment. And I didn't talk today about actually the meat of the paper that I will ask Chandan to circulate, which is in effect about the question, what is the conceptual logic of having goals? And to my mind, that problem has never been adequately addressed in all of this. There's been a drumbeat without that being addressed. So for instance, in the paper, we refer to 3 arguments that we think of as being sensible when thinking about goals. One is that a goal can have what we call an epistemic purpose by identifying a focus of some kind and enabling data, for instance, to be generated that refers to that focus and so on. The other is motivational, that whether or not paired with external incentives, a goal may provide, intrinsically or extrinsically, certain kind of motivational benefits. And the third we refer to as coordinative, that it may be that focusing on a goal jointly enables one to take advantage of certain kinds of complementarities or spillovers or avoid certain kinds of problems that arise as a result of the lack of that. So these are 3 things that we see, I should have mentioned it in my talk, but 3 things that we see as being possible arguments for having goals in any type of group context. And indeed, in an individual context, these would also apply to some degree, at least the first 2. But you don't find any United Nations document that explicitly refers to these arguments and makes the case as to, or similar ones, as to why it is that development goals exactly should be the very center of the development discussion. So as a form of second best reasoning, I don't disagree with you, but I'm wondering what the first best, what the first best is and whether the first best is still in some sense attainable. So what I'm calling for in some respect is not for a rejection of goal-based thinking if what that means is to give some kind of a content to this high-level idea of a flourishing world society and its conditions. But to move away from thinking of those goals as a framework for detailed programmatic action and for allocation of resources, which I think it has been to some degree. And so to the extent it can be on the one side of the spectrum rather than the other, I think it would be in the interests of efficacy, as well as of providing a normative framework which can be more readily adopted by a wider range of participants. Now, whether the donor agencies, again on Chiranjeev's question, were ever really made accountable by this discourse, I have my serious doubts. It's not clear to me that one can find any indications of that. I think that some of the donor agencies did enthusiastically adopt this discourse, but where is the accountability? I mean, this is a period where, if anything, not only have the aid allocations, which are of course an unimportant and irrelevant sideshow for a country like, not only India, but many countries, but very important for others, not only have they languished in quantitative terms, but they have been restructured qualitatively. So for example, many countries have moved their aid agencies into their ministries of foreign affairs or of commerce, and given them a more directly either political or economic mandate, instrumentalized them, taken away altogether or at least attenuated the ethical discourse underlying aid earlier. Yes. Yes. That's a good point. There have been phases, right? There have been phases. There was Tide aid. There was a rebellion against Tide aid. Now there's Tide aid again, basically, because there are a number of countries where the national public in those countries has said, we will sanction an aid program only if it benefits our commercial interests or is tied into our political and foreign policy interests. Right? This has happened across the board. Or there are other countries, I mean, the Danish, I think, are an example of the first kind, or the British too, to a degree. The United States is an example of the second kind. There are countries such as Spain and Italy, which never had much of an aid program to begin with. They increased their aid expenditures a bit, and then they've basically gone back more or less to where they were, to different extents. So I think that this is a sideshow, basically, aid. It's not the important story in development. Private investment flows are far more important. Remittances are today far more important, even if one is doing a quantitative calculation. I think it's a mistake for us to be focusing on it. I've been talking about it because there's a link between this discourse and aid, and I used aid as an example. But I'm not sure the aid agencies have been made accountable. I'm not sure anybody has been made accountable. I mean, one of the things that we talk about in our paper is also the question of how you attribute responsibility when you have a complex event which multiple different actors are involved in producing through a joint impact that they have. How do you attribute responsibility? If you want to ask the question, why were the floods that took place in Chennai so destructive, right? There would be a number of different arguments you can give, but pointing a finger at one particular individual or even entity is not especially straightforward to do. That's the nature of a complex event, and I think that that's the case with many of the outcomes with which we're concerned. So that's a problem that worries me, that there's the kind of conceptual, the kind of causal interdependencies which are involved make that very hard. Now Vishnu's about to leave, so you're here, okay. Human rights discourse. Yeah, very interesting. I don't have a sewn up theory of this. Many people would point to the end of the Cold War, of course, as crucial in this respect. That throughout the Cold War, economic and social rights were viewed as problematic by the Western countries, in particular by the United States, even more problematic than they were viewed as later on because of their association with the Soviet discourse in global fora and some of the polarization which took place as a result. I'm familiar, of course, with the ideas of people like Hart and Negri and others who would argue that it's all part of a single complex, and human rights discourse as deployed by certain NGOs, neoliberal discourse as deployed in Davos, and interventionist, militarized foreign policy are all part of a single complex. I'm not convinced of that. That's a little too aggregative and functionalist for me. Maybe I'm just simple-minded, I'm sure I am. So I don't really see that as being obvious. But where am I speaking from? I'm just basically trying to give you an account of of my effort to make sense of these developments for myself, I have no what can one say? I'm not embracing a particularly directive point of view here, I don't think, at least not in this particular discussion. Pragmatism, yes, interesting. I mean, I'm a pragmatist with respect to many of these questions. I think we should look around and try to learn from what works in some sense. But we should also have a robust spirit of skepticism when somebody says they've found out what works. Right? Because finding out what works is always a work in progress. And that's the difficulty with the Sachs point of view, for instance, that you discover interventions A, B, C, D, E, validated by randomized trials or not, right? And you roll them out. That's a kind of fake pragmatism, right? Based on basically a heavy rhetorical overlay or sustained by that, rather than by, I would say, any type of real scientificity. And I think that real scientificity would lead us away from a best practice and intervention-based approach, micro-intervention-based approach toward much more openness in our understanding of what may be appropriate in a given context, much more learning-oriented approach, and one which also sees the nested relations between hierarchical levels in terms of choice of institutions, actions, policies. Which could make what works, quote unquote, in one place very different from what works, quote unquote, in another place. But perhaps, I'm sure there's more to say we can discuss. Krishna, randomized trials, I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but let me say that I think that the people you mentioned, Lant, Pritchett, etc., they're within that frame in a certain way. You know, I don't view them as external critics. I view them more as internal critics in some sense, because they're part of a really detailed methodological debate as to how it is that you find out what works. Right? They're not necessarily questioning the idea that when you find out what works in one place, then you can roll it out. I mean, to some degree they are when they talk about considerations of external validity and so on. But I think that they have a mechanistic understanding of society still in many cases. Now, that may be too prejudicial an interpretation, in which case tell me so. But when somebody says you should use structural econometrics rather than randomized trials, or you should use discontinuity-based inference, natural experiments rather than randomized trials or something else, I view that as a kind of debate within the family. Right? Maybe it's an important debate, but it's still within the family. I think that there is a more radical, as it were, point of view here, which is that that type of highly technocratic kind of inference for purposes of policy design has a much more limited role to play than generally thought. That what we really need to do is embed learning in institutions at every level in a permanent way. That's a different perspective. It makes the economist much less important, and it should be. The economist should be less important in all of this. I don't know if that spoke to your question.
Okay, I have a... So Sanjay, thank you very much for your thoughts. We have a core course here in the MA Development program called Theory and Philosophy of Development, and many of the students who have taken the course are here, and I'm one of the people who teaches that course. So we walk them through a historical view of development, very much in the way that you began your talk with. And we have them read Modernization and Dependency and W.W. Rostow, and then we critique development and bring them all the way to Wolfgang Sachs and Escobar and Illich and Nandi and Ranima and all of these people. And at every point, there is an attempt to draw a scorecard of development in the way that you spoke of. And at the end of the course, I think we're all every time left with a lot of puzzling questions, and I'm sure the students are also smiling and resonating the puzzling questions about development. I mean, if at in every effort, the scorecard says, you know, this really didn't work so well. So I want to go back to the question of what you said, why goals? You know, there's this critique of development that we embed in students' thinking. But at the end of it, when we talk about alternatives, or moving away from these macro systems of thinking and power altogether, I don't know that we leave students with very tangible answers in which they can ground themselves and move on. So critique, certainly, you know, and this goes back every time to questions of where are we speaking from? Not just you, but where are we all speaking from when we stand in front of students and then live our everyday lives? So I'm not sure there's a lot of, I mean, I've read a lot of critiques of the new sustainable development goals and how it's the new bureaucracy reinvented and, you know, all of that. So why? I mean, what is at stake now and what makes us feel or believe that the SDGs are going to do any better than, you know, midday meal programs or ICTS or Mdgs or any other acronym of development that we have learned about? So I guess I'm also thinking about all the students here and the course we have to teach again this semester.
Thanks, Sanjay. I think you know that I agree with everything you said. And in the spirit of the last thing you mentioned about making economists less important, which also I agree with, I wonder, you know, a lot of the times, I think even you maybe said something like this, when we critique the post-1990s development discourse and you know, MDGs and so on, there's a harkening back to the days when development was considered more holistically. However, I think you would agree there was a lot of top-down, similar in the sense, in the meta sense of being very expert-led. What works type of thinking, except it was maybe conducted in a different paradigm. You know, so there were, in the 50s and 60s, a lot of important debates. But to me, they sound an awful lot like, again, economists and experts sitting in a room and figuring out what works. Perhaps more holistically, I don't know. Now, going forward, if we have to think of some truly different way of doing things, I mean, would you argue for going back to what was the, not going back is a bad word, but you know, doing that kind of development, or a completely different kind, you know, which we haven't really done at all, maybe, or perhaps has been done in some bottom-up way, you know, the way perhaps Azim in the book Churning the Earth sort of talks about, you know, those kinds of grassroots initiatives and so on. So your thoughts on that?
Coming from a kind of a practitioner's point of view, I've worked more in NGOs, I'm not an academic. And I worked largely in human rights and, with Amnesty International under Salil Shetty, who actually led MGD, so it was an interesting mix because the complaint of the human rights world was that MDGs are not based in rights. And although in some senses accountable, there was no real mechanism of accountability because they weren't based in rights-based development. India has had its own trajectory in a different kind of way in that sense. So I was wondering what you thought about it. And the other I was thinking about as you were speaking was a lot of state kind of importance and focus on how do you hold states accountable, but less and less on corporate accountability. I mean, if you see the current statistics, the wonderful BRICS that we all spoke about has actually fallen in growth, minus 31%. Maybe because of fallen commodity prices, or debt-led growth that we're all fearing that China might crash and what's going to happen, blah, blah, blah. And you've seen corporate, like, I don't know if you know the term FANG that is now in, which is FANG, which is Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google. The new term to replace BRICS, apparently, which is now grown by 260% in the market and has a large share and influences largely when they talk about even rights or in development work through the impact investing world or the social enterprise, and what are the international community's mechanism in controlling corporate growth and their responsibility?
Should I go ahead?
We have a lot of time. These questions.
We're out of time. Okay. So, on the first question, how to go beyond critique, that's the question, right? Of course, absolutely crucial. I think that the answer to that has very much also to do with the answer to Amit's question, namely that one should indeed look around the world and see what are the innovations, successful experiments at any level which can be learned from. But I think that one should also systematize that process of learning. And I think that at its best, those forms of development discourse that that took place in activist and civil society spaces had some of that element, but even in intergovernmental relations, South-South relations, there were some aspects of that at certain moments. And I think that to make the United Nations a little less of a forum for rolling out platforms and a little more of a forum for sharing and learning from such experiences, and not only the United Nations, any number of other such contexts, institutional contexts, would be part of the prescription, right? And I think one can have a curriculum which is centered on that, or at least gives more importance to that. And I think if one were to do that in a disciplined and careful and systematic way, one would have to think through a lot of questions analytically. So for example, a lot of people are interested in cooperatives when they think about alternatives in development, but as you know, the experience with cooperatives in the world is very uneven, right? Lots of cooperatives have failed, and the literature on cooperatives is full of reasons that they fail. And then there are some cooperatives that succeed, and sometimes networks of cooperatives succeed, or certain models of cooperatives succeed, right? Whether the dairy cooperatives in India are a case of success or failure can and has been discussed, right? One can talk about that. Are the Mondragon cooperatives in Spain especially successful for certain reasons? Because of the way they have designed their relationship to one another, the fact they have certain shared institutions at the center, such as a bank, etc., or a certain doctrine in the background which everybody shares as to how decisions should be made. All of that can be discussed, right? I see that as a very constructive, positive, programmatic type of endeavor, which is not, which is largely not taken up, because I think people are, in the critique of development, are very much focused upon that with certain good reason, but there's much more to do that they're not doing, and we ought to do in a curriculum. And in our research and in our action and thinking. Amit, I think that also speaks to your point, but I know you're very interested especially in the kinds of knowledge which are tacit, which are resident in communities that may not be recognized, and which you view, I think rightly, as being very central to the productive life of such communities and people. And I think that one of the things that a less bureaucratized conception of development would do would be precisely to try to create institutional forms through which that knowledge could be mobilized, used by people for themselves. When I say used, I don't mean by pharmaceutical companies raiding indigenous medical knowledge, as you were describing the other day in a conversation we had, but rather put to use by people for themselves in ways that also are empowering. I believe very much that the market economy is not the enemy. The problem is an undemocratic market economy. And to create ways in which market society and economy can have a place, and in which people can be empowered to participate on terms that are accessible to them and remunerative to them, is very much a goal under contemporary conditions. But that's something that we can talk about further. MDGs, are they based on rights or not? And what about corporate accountability? Excellent questions. Thank you for the acronym. I didn't know about it. So now defanged will have a new meaning for me, as well as FANG. I think this has been a debate, right? There are people who have taken the view that the MDGs are rights-based, or that they're connected to human development, the human development concept. They're even a realization of the human development concept, that they're a concrete way of thinking about what it means to expand people's choices and give them elementary capabilities. But whether you take that view or you take the view that this is a freestanding framework that was derived from entirely different sources that has nothing to do with those ideas, I think depends a lot on your view of the goals. My own perspective on this is that there was certainly no effort conceptually to root the MDGs in any rights-based conception or indeed in human development. So that's all an ex post rationalization, which had to be done in some sense to make sense of these goals from the point of view of the stakeholders, some of the stakeholders at least, especially those on the more activist side, who wanted to embrace the MDGs because they were the only game in town. So from a second best point of view, it made a certain sense for them to try to rationalize or justify them in that way. But I think if one looks at it historically, their genealogy had very little to do with that. And you see certain ruptures, right? Various ruptures in that regard. To take one example, which I didn't talk about, but is close to my own work, the way in which poverty is conceptualized has almost nothing to do with human rights. So if you took a human rights-based view of what poverty is, you would not end up with the $1.25 a day or $1 a day indicator, for example. Now, on corporate accountability, one of the interesting things about the SDG process is that there was what was called multi-stakeholder engagement in the open working group, etc. Goodness, what a mouthful. So multi-stakeholder engagement means basically bringing to the table everybody who views themselves as a stakeholder or could be viewed as a stakeholder in principle, but in practice it has very much meant giving an important role to corporations. And business roundtables, chambers of commerce, and so on have been active at the national and international level in these processes. And I understand played a significant role in shaping the SDG agenda, and in particular in taking certain things out of it or watering down certain things. So for example, because of the post-2008 concern with inequality in the world, before the final documents were adopted, there was a considerable interest in giving a central role to inequality reduction. But the version of that concern that was eventually incorporated was, by all accounts, considerably watered down because of resistance from certain governments, but also from corporate interests. And there's a paper that was done specifically on the corporate influence on this process, which we cite in our own paper, that documents some of this. So I think that would be another interesting angle to pursue further, that there's a sense in which the SDGs as a high-level framework could not really challenge very many people, given the fact that they're the product of multi-stakeholder engagement. And so if we're looking for something that is more challenging, then we will probably have to look elsewhere. But of course, there are potentials here still. As with anything, you can always ask institutions to at least live up to their own claims and demands, and that's an important thing to do, right? If liberal democracy in countries around the world, including in India, were to live up to its own claims, that would be a very considerable achievement that would change many people's lives for the better. So
Thank you.
I think stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Please join me in.
Thanks, John.